This video is about Alzheimer's. It's not a formal medical video, it's not going to go into great detail, it's very much designed as a relaxing discussion about Alzheimer's. And the people who are going to benefit most from it will be people with Alzheimer's, people looking after people with Alzheimer's, and potentially MD who could, well, end up looking after some with Alzheimer's. And on the basis of how many people that get it could be anybody. You know, it's something that's worth knowing. So here's a brief summary of what Alzheimer's is. Alzheimer's, which has gone under various other names, including dementia, is the degeneration of the brain. It's something happens in the brain that stops the neural networks communicating with each other, and it gradually forms blocks, and you lose memories and the ability to speak. And everything just gradually, just your whole universe just gradually gets smaller. And this is where, if you've actually got Alzheimer's, you're the winner here, because ultimately, I'd rather you didn't get Alzheimer's, but you're only going to notice at the beginning because your vocabulary will reduce. Silly things like words like cup or chair will just disappear from your vocabulary. And as time goes on, because you're forgetting things, you don't actually remember that you knew them in the first place. So all that happens is your world gets smaller, and it's not going to be a bad experience. The main thing is, if you've got Alzheimer's, don't worry about it. For people who are looking after people with Alzheimer's, it's a bit more complex, because the way it happens is that people revert back to a basic human natural instincts. Now, it's worth mentioning, it's quite important to mention at this point in time, there are other medical conditions that can masquerade as Alzheimer's. They can throw up similar symptoms. They can be things like loss of memory, tiredness, fatigue in your muscles and bones. And one of those in particular is Lyme's disease. So it's always worth, if someone has what appears to be Alzheimer's, it's worth getting a test for Lyme's disease just as a precaution, because the difference is that while there's no known cure at this point in 2019 when I'm making this video for Alzheimer's, there is a cure for Lyme's. It's an antibiotic treatment. So it's just worth mentioning that, because it may actually save people a lot of grief. So my mother got Alzheimer's, and this is where the experience of this situation comes from. And what happened was that initially she started losing the vocabulary, as I mentioned, and we'd end up filling in the words, you know, when she'd forget something like, say, I'm just going to have a cup of, we'd say tea, coffee, and she'd go, tea, that's it, I've got a cup of tea. And she could remember the words once she was reminded of them, but ultimately gradually the vocabulary just disappeared. But at that point in time, it's kind of important to know that the person that you know who's got Alzheimer's, spend lots of time with them, because it's not going to be that long before the memory has gone. They may not even know who you are. So at that point with my mother, we went holidays. We went to Australia, which was quite nice, and we spent a lot of time together. And as my mum's memory gradually dwindled away, she was living on her own, and I was fortunate in being self-employed, so I could go over and look after her on alternate months. I could spend a month with my mum and a month away. This is kind of important because my mum lived on an island, and it actually involved flights or ferries to actually get there. And she was fine. We decided we'll give her as much independence as possible before we step in. And it's interesting watching what happens, because as someone gets Alzheimer's, they just go back to the basic, almost like Stone Age humans. They lose, in a way, part of their personality. They lose their memories, but they develop interesting traits and habits that you'd normally associate with just a bare essential human. And one of those is the hunter-gatherer instinct. Because humans in our native form as animals, we'd go out walking and we'd walk miles and we'd go and hunt for things and gather things. And in this day and age, it's not quite as barbaric as going and hunting animals and stuff like that. It tends to be going to shops and buying stuff or picking stuff up that you see that you like. It's just, and it's kind of fascinating in a way. Once you actually see it, you'll realize what I'm talking about, and it is very interesting. So, my mum did develop this sort of hunter-gatherer instinct, and she'd go out and collect stuff. And because she was so mobile, and because she wasn't in a place that I'd consider dangerous, it was in the countryside, we gave her a high-vis jacket. And we found we had to sew the pockets of the jacket up because otherwise she stuffed it until it was bulging to capacity with things like leftover food and things like that, which wasn't terribly hygienic. Anything else would have been fine, but stuffing it with food wasn't so great. But the high-vis jacket was a workman's jacket. It made her visible if she was out on a road somewhere. It kept her warm and it kept her dry, and these are kind of essential in situations like that. Obviously, if someone's in a city, the things will be different. We also found it useful because she was in the countryside to fit her with a tracker, and it sounds a bit sinister to do that, but a GPS tracker, readily available. The type we used was a TK102, readily available off eBay. If you go to bigclive.com, my website, you'll find, in the things to make and do, you'll find a page just dedicated to setting that up. And it varies from network to network, but that gives the basics. And it's one of these things that it's a mass-produced, copied, left, right, and centre tracker. It's cheap, it's very functional, and it's very standard because it was copied from the original manufacturer, which is a shame for that manufacturer. But the benefit is that hopefully the compensation is that it makes life so much easier for people who are looking after people with Alzheimer's, because having that tracker sewn into a little pocket that we could change the battery in, a bit of Velcro, it made such a huge difference because when my mum would go missing, all you had to do was phone the tracker and it would send back a text message and it would tell you where she was. I can't even start to tell you how wonderful that feature was. It would send you back a Google Maps link, which is just amazing. We ended up giving her two because they're a bit quirky at times. We gave her one as a watch, but we made sure we told her it was a present because they love presents. Oh, they just love gifts. When someone is getting Alzheimer's and they're going to that base nature, possessions become quite important. It is a strange and fascinating glimpse at human nature. So, latterly, we also, before she'd gone too far, before she needed full-time care, we fitted an RFID unit on. She loved to keep her keys around her neck. We added a tag that hung a bit below that and added some equipment to the door that would unlock it when she came home. So it meant the door, she didn't need to worry about the keys. The door would always unlock for her. So my mum managed herself for quite a while, and it was only when she really, really got lost one day, this actually predates the tracker in fact, that my brother had to sell his house and move across to look after her. We'd told her right from the beginning that we wouldn't put her in a care home because, well, there were many advantages to that. I just liked the idea that my mum was cared for in her own house, and in her latter days, she was in her own bed, in her own bedroom, surrounded by her own stuff, and that's kind of important. So this whole hoarding thing, the gathering of stuff and bringing it back, her bedroom, she filled it up with stuff. She filled her whole house up with stuff. And it's kind of important to note that that is their possession. So if you're looking after them, you'll notice that they gather stuff. It's just their natural instinct as a human. And that's their possessions, and they'll bring in things that maybe you don't really want them to have in the house, things that are unhygienic or just damp rags or things covered in slugs that they found out in the street, and they bring it in. It's important that you can get rid of those things. Don't do it in front of them. Make sure that if you're going to disturb their possessions, that you don't just grab it off them, because that is honestly, it's like someone grabbing your bag or your mobile phone. It's like taking their possessions from them. And when someone's got Alzheimer's, that is really important not to do that. It can be done once they've lost sight of it, that they're distracted by something else. They're having a cup of tea, they're having a cookie. Then you can secret those things away and they won't notice. That's just important. I can't stress the importance of letting them have their hoard and their little cave, their room full of their stuff, their possessions that they just like. It's human nature. It'll make things so much easier in the long run. The care home situation, we decided not to put my mum into a care home. We didn't even know much about it at that time. We're very glad we didn't. We were fortunate in that I was self-employed. I could spend lots of time over. My brother was close to retirement age anyway, for early retirement, and was able to take early retirement, and he moved over with her. And now we know more about the care homes. There were some good care homes, there were some bad care homes. It's unfortunate that the governments of the world are not very good at looking after people with Alzheimer's. Their prime interest is in investing in care homes and making lots of money. Granny farms, in other words. And some homes are just barbaric. They really are just basically prisons for old people. So it's worth keeping that in mind, that it's not necessarily a good thing. However, that didn't affect us. We kept my mum at home. She had the free run of the house, and it was fine. I mean, it wasn't that fine. It wasn't easy. It was a bit of a struggle. There's some things you should know, for instance. As they sort of regress back to the base human thing, they'll reflect emotions and they'll do weird things, and it can get on your wick. So, it can annoy you at times. It's really important to know that if you're angry with them, if you shout at them, all it will do is get the same reaction back. It will be like an emotional mirror, so to speak. And it can get into a vicious circle that, you get angry with them and then they return the anger, and you get angrier and they return the anger. It's important to note, and really, it's so easy to solve that. Go out the room, calm yourself down, walk back in, and a bright, cheery voice say, "Would you like some coffee and cookies?" And they'll go, "Oh, yes, please." And it's over. It's worth remembering that if you're angry to them, they will be angry back. And if you're nice to them, they will be nice back. Just remember that they are going back to natural instincts. And it sounds odd when I say this, but if you ever actually look after someone with Alzheimer's, you will realise that's happening. And that makes life a lot easier too. Drugs. Oh dear. I'd love to say there's a cure for Alzheimer's. But at this point in 2019, there's not a cure for Alzheimer's. There are drugs available by the pharmaceutical industry who, out of desperation for money, they put out drugs, and we had two that we tried with my mother. The first one we were prescribed was Aricept. And when we did some research, this very expensive pill had no real tangible evidence that it did anything major. It did not have any obvious effect on my mother. It didn't slow the gradual regression into loss of memory. It is, in our opinion, a very, very expensive placebo. I asked the doctor, I said, "Is this just a placebo?" And he said, "No, it's not." And I said, "Is it an expensive drug?" And he said, "It's an incredibly expensive drug." I said, "Then ultimately we think it's a placebo. We'd like to stop that." And there was no difference. Honestly, it's so useless that you might as well give your mum M&Ms or Smarties, chocolate sweeties, chocolate candy. It would have more effect. Chocolate, by the way, there's no limit to how much chocolate you can give someone with Alzheimer's. Pamper them, treat them, cakes, cafes, chocolate, just treat them all the time, because it's just one of these things that doesn't matter anymore. They're not going to look after their weight. They don't really gain much weight, to be honest, just because they're so active. The drugs, the second drug we got was Ibixa, and it did have an effect. It had the effect of dragging my mum out of the gentle decline into Alzheimer's that she wasn't noticing up to that point. She was so happy up to the point she got Ibiza, and then it just dragged her out and basically shook her and said, "You've got Alzheimer's, you're dying, it had such a negative effect. She was going to neighbours' doors, ring the doorbell, they'd answer, she'd burst into tears and tell them she wanted to commit suicide. It's the point my brother was just being driven to his wit's end. I said, stop giving her that drug if that's what it is. That's the point I had to abandon things and I had to go over to and share the responsibility at that time because that was the turning point. I would recommend not, until real drugs are available, don't use drugs for Alzheimer's because they are destructive. They completely have the wrong effect. Candy is the best drug. Things worth mentioning. Oh, okay. Incontinence is worth mentioning early on because it will happen. It really is. As the memories fade away, it starts with the short-term memories, just flippant things that happened recently. They won't stick in the memory anymore. You can tell your mum over and over again, this is how you use the toilet. They won't remember how to use the toilet. What does stick for longer is long-term memories, habits, things they really enjoyed doing, music. All these things stick, and by the time it all gets to the end, it's just natural human instincts have taken over, and the person doesn't know you anymore. They don't know their friends, but you can still communicate with them, but they are just basically responding to vocal intonation. If you're upbeat, they'll be upbeat. If you're downbeat, they'll be downbeat. It doesn't matter. All that really matters is you're making their life comfortable, and more importantly, that you don't get too stressed about it. I can't stress that enough. It's really important to keep living your own life, relax, know what's happening, and that's where this video will help. And there'll be lots of weird things. That hunter-gatherer thing, my mum kind of marked her territory in the house. It sounds a bit weird, it's a bit unpleasant. She'd get bits of tissue paper, toilet paper, and she'd poke them into crevices all around the house. She'd just mark the place. I'm not sure why. Human instinct, perhaps? Some of those bits of toilet paper were soiled. That wasn't good, but not to worry. It turns out that's not just us that happened to. It seems to be quite a common thing. You should be aware of this. The incontinence thing. There are lots of things available for that. Your mother or father or family member is regressing back ultimately through their life. They're just living their life in reverse. Instead of learning, they're unlearning. And the whole incontinence thing, it really is important to know that you have to plan in advance. Just don't leave it till it's happened, because a soggy bed is a terrible thing. They don't dry out very quickly and they smell of piss, basically. Oh, right, okay, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but welcome to reality. There will be poo, there will be pee. That's what happens. The good news is you can get bed covers that are comfortable. They're waterproof bed covers in advance. You also get things called Sahara sheets that go in the bed under the person. They're comfortable. They will prevent any major spillage. As time goes on, diapers will be needed, and that's a bit of a learning experience if you're not used to that. Me and my brother are both single men. We didn't have any family experience of babies or anything, so it was an experience, particularly when you're changing the diapers on a very mobile person. It's worth mentioning at this point in time that, contrary to what other people might say, it's not like looking after a baby at all. There are connections to looking after a baby, but if your baby's 10 stone and can punch and has flashbacks to past lives, then I suppose in a way it could be like looking after a baby, but not really. There are things you should know, handy tips. You get diapers, nappies, that can be put on with double-sided tabs, so they're easier to put on, just like babies, but bigger. You get the pull-up ones that we started off with, and things that, people just won't tell you. There are other ways to get them off. Don't get them off by pulling them down while your mum stands there and then expect her to step out of them. It's not going to happen, and it's full of poo. It's going to go terribly wrong. It's worth noting that if you rip the sides of them, you can then pull them off without actually having to get them to step out. They are designed to be ripped at the side. Nobody mentions that. Your healthcare provider, or if you live in a barbaric country that doesn't provide free healthcare, the Isle of Man, where we were, and Britain, particularly Scotland, provide all the healthcare because they understand that looking after the workforce, looking after the people that live there and make society is kind of important. You know, other countries could do with learning that. Scotland's very progressive that way, as is the Isle of Man. We look after our workers and our elderly because we appreciate that they're contributing to society and they've already done a lot to contribute to society, so they deserve to be looked after. The incontinence, that's right. Okay, here's an interesting thing that happened. My mother initially went long walks, and it got a bit annoying, particularly at night time when she was out going long walks, because it was a bit scary, and you had the GPS tracking and saying, where is she, where is she? And you'd go out and find her, and she'd be like, I don't care, I'm just having great walks. There was a day, and it happened every year at winter, because this went on for some time. Oh, it's worth mentioning at this point in time. Alzheimer's can last a year. It can be really fast, or it can last a long time. In our case, it lasted an unusually long time, to the point the carers were saying, I take it your mum passed. We're saying, no, she's still alive. And they'd be going, what? They'd be really surprised. It was an unusual case. Don't worry. Ours was unusual. My mum was super fit and healthy, and the degrading of memory loss was slow. It just took a while. But it's also worth mentioning that if it happens quickly, they may do post-mortems just to check you didn't bump her off. Yes, because once you've experienced Alzheimer's, you'll realise that there are times that people do think of such things. It's just, unfortunately, human nature that when, things are getting to you, and yeah, if you ever experience it, you'll know what I'm talking about. Don't bump them off. That's a weird bit there. Smaller worlds. Every winter, something happened. A step went down. My mother's world got a bit smaller, and she stopped. One winter, she just went to the front door. She looked out, and she decided, nah, not going to go out anymore. Just going to wander around the house. And that was it. She never went outside again. The world had gone from being the full world to just the house, and she'd occasionally look out the door or the window and go, interesting, but she wasn't really interested in going out. This was a huge relief, but it also had its downsides because she was always just hovering about. When someone's got Alzheimer's, they'll often just stick to you. They'll just hang about with you and start living your life. You stand up, they stand up. You sit down, they sit down. If you're used to living life on your own, like me and my brother were, that's a bit intimidating at first, but you get used to it. And the whole smaller world thing, one thing happened that at night time, my mum, because hours don't really matter, that they don't follow normal hours, she'd come downstairs in the middle of the night, and we thought that was a bit scary. We were worried that she might fall down the stairs. Particularly in one case when I was looking after my mum, I was living over with her. My brother had gone away travelling with work, and I was living, and one morning I got up and there was a loud thud outside the door, and I thought, oh, what was that? And I jumped out of bed, opened the door, and my mum was just picking herself up off the floor, and she was holding a pillow in front of herself, and she was all slurred. I thought, oh no, she's had a stroke or something like that. And then she flomped down on her pillow again, and I thought, all right, okay, I'm going to go downstairs. I'm going to get her a cup of water. I'm just going to see what's happening here. And I went downstairs, and there was a bottle of whiskey, an open bottle of whiskey, a very, very half-full, I'm sure had been full bottle of whiskey sitting on the table. And she had gone down, decided to have whiskey, and she'd got drunk. And that she had the pillow in front of herself because she kept falling over. And because it's human natural instinct, if you're falling over, grab something soft to fall on, and she grabbed a pillow. And the reason she was slurring was because she was drunk, and I had to help her downstairs and sit her down, get her a strong cup of coffee, and then just ride out the drunkenness and the resultant hangover. It was memorable. The next thing I did was I went round, got all bottles of stuff, including bleach and disinfectant from under the kitchen sink. I locked them in a room because up to that point it hadn't even gone through my mind that she would start drinking stuff randomly out of bottles. The small world thing. We were worried that she'd fall down the stairs, so we looked at stair gates for kids, but my mum was super strong, super active. We were scared that if we put a little kiddie gate at the top of the stairs, she'd climb over it, and if she climbed over the banister, she could actually fall right over the banisters. So I talked to my brother and said, why don't we just build one? Why don't we actually build a wall up there with a proper door in it that we can just make sure that she can't open the door? So we just went right out there, and then we scribbled the drawing down measured it up of the top of the stairs, and got some 2x2 wooden battens and some plywood and some hinges and a little catch, and we screwed the battens to the wall, and we basically made a frame with a door in it. And we discovered, initially in the morning we'd open the door and leave it open, but we discovered that we could leave the door shut in the morning, and when my mum woke up, she didn't realise that downstairs even existed. It's this whole thing about the world getting smaller. So there were times that, during the day, we'd just take her up her food and drink and make sure she didn't see us going through the secret door. And she was happy just poshing around with her bags of stuff upstairs and eating her snacks. And, if it was winter, if it was cool, she'd just snuggle into bed and we'd take her up her fried food. It was all kiddie food we gave her, things like chips, potato fries, and onion rings and fish fingers. She loved fish fingers and chicken dippers. Kids' food is great because they're kids ultimately. And latterly, at the end of the day, we'd open the door, and if she wanted, she'd come downstairs and she'd sit next to the fire. And we got loads of videos. There was no TV reception over in that area, but we got loads of videos because we found out that she liked In the Night Garden, and it was a BBC Kids series, and it was just aimed at kids, and she just enjoyed watching it, and it kept her amused. So we got loads of these DVDs of In the Night Garden. And at night she'd go upstairs and settle down, and we'd close the door over again. And it's also worth pointing out at this point in time that you don't have to be with them all the time. There's this strange thing that people expect you to be just watching them continuously. You can still live your own life while you're looking after someone. And in that case where my mum was in her own little closed zone, warm, cozy zone with her stuff, we decided that maximum we'd ever leave her on her own was 3 or 4 hours. And we worked at on the basis that when you go to work, you're allowed a tea break or lunch break every 3 or 4 hours. So I guess that's reasonable enough. And if it was particularly hot summer, we'd just make sure we're there more often to keep her hydrated with liquid. It really is. There's another thing, hydration and food. Don't cut down the amount of liquid in the belief that it's going to save you changing her panties. We looked on it as a measure of our success that her pants were full because we wanted to keep her hydrated. You would not like it if you weren't being given drinks during the day. And you know what it's like? You're thirsty, you get a headache. Don't let them dehydrate. It's important to keep them hydrated with lots of water or tea or coffee on a regular basis. Time goes on. And another step happens in the winter. It just seemed a seasonal thing. My mother suddenly couldn't walk anymore. And when it happened, I was looking after her. Just one day she wasn't walking about so much, and she sat in the bed and then fell off it. Unfortunately, she fell off the bed against the door, pushing it shut, and I couldn't get into her room. And it was a bit worrying, and I finally managed to get in. And I lifted her back up onto the bed, and she was quite agitated because, it's just what happens. As the Alzheimer's sets in, it affects the memories first, but then it starts affecting muscles and physical ability to walk and move arms. So I sought medical attention at that point in time. I didn't know what was happening, and the people were really helpful. They said, "We're going to send someone out to check," and they took her into hospital and they double checked she was all right, and then said, ultimately, this is the next step in Alzheimer's. She's just losing control of her legs. And uh, I brought her home. They took her away in an ambulance. Then I took the car through, and then drove back with her that evening. And I had to carry her upstairs. She didn't like being carried upstairs. There was no other way to get her to bed. I laid her in bed, and she ultimately, other than lifting her out into sitting positions, that was the point that she was just in her bedroom for the rest of her life. She didn't really come down anymore after that because it would have involved somehow carrying her downstairs. So we just made her homely upstairs. We brought a little TV up and put it in a movable bracket, and we got the DVD player built into the TV and played her kiddie programs up there. And she was fine. She didn't know any better. She was come from the bed. As time went on, her ability to eat solid foods gradually degenerated, and you just adapt automatically. She couldn't eat the solid foods, so we spoon fed her with soft foods. And this is where you make, in a way, it's like baby food. You get a blender, you get tins of beans and stuff like that, and you blend them down. You make a nice, yummy paste. It's not baby food, it's much more high calorie, it's much tastier, it's got salt and sugar in it, it's delicious. I ate it myself, it was really nice. But you can improvise lots of foods, just blend them down. Ralph used to make full meals. He'd make a portion for himself, a portion for my mum, he'd put it in the blender, and then spoon feed it. But as time went on, my mum lost the ability to eat off a spoon. And at that point, we were already giving her drinks from a baby bottle because she'd just spill it if you tried giving it from a cup. And the baby bottle, she actually suckled on it. She actually latched onto it. There's a natural instinct that she liked drinking from the baby bottle, that's little silicone teat in the end. So all we did was we got another baby bottle with another silicone teat. They came from, they're cheap. We got them, those ones from Poundland. They were just perfect for the job because they were squeezable, which is quite important. And we cut the end of the teat off to make it a bigger hole so we could actually squirt the food into her mouth in little, like the equivalent of spoonfuls, and she'd eat it. But as time went on, she lost the ability, and this is how people end up passing away from Alzheimer's. It's just something you adapt. You don't realise it's happening at the time. They lose the ability to swallow, and they don't understand how to eat. You've probably heard this, that they forget how to eat, but this is what happens, that you can put the food in their mouth and it just sits there and it gradually slides down, and then the reflexes kick in and they'll swallow it. But as time goes on, it gets harder and harder, and they'll often choke on the food. You have to sit them up at the correct angle, and then you have to feed them very carefully. But in our case, in the end, as with all cases really, what happened in the end was my mum couldn't eat, didn't eat in the end. And she, we sought medical attention. They said, sorry, this is what happens. And then she passed. Other things worth mentioning here. There are lots of things available online. When they get bedbound, things will happen. We found my mum's hands curled and her arms curled in, and things you might not notice or even think of happening. Her hands curled tightly, really tightly, like she was gripping them all the time. And we ended up putting little pads in her hand, little rolled up bits of foam in her hand to keep them open, because if we didn't, her nails grew and actually damaged her skin. So it's important to keep the nails trimmed and know that this might happen, doesn't happen to everybody, it's what happens. To keep her clean, we would lift her out of bed. I don't know if this is standard practice, it's what we did because we could. We got foam mats, we put them in the bath. We'd carry her through, lay her in the bath, and this is another thing you're going to have to get used to, is washing your mum. I mean, I would never have thought that I'd be looking after mum, but ultimately when it came to the crunch, me and my brother were looking after just our little baby girl, really. So you just adapt. We'd lay her into the bath, and then I'd shower her thoroughly with the shower, just rub some soap on, give her feet a massage, do her hair, baby shampoo so it didn't, get in her eyes and hurt her eyes, but you're careful. Then we'd lift her out and we'd towel her down, and then we'd carry her through and put her back in bed. We did this on a regular basis. Music is an important thing here. Be careful if you put a radio on the background. We did get radio reception there, shady radio reception, not the best. But we used to put on things like The Archers, but we found that when she was upstairs in her own, The Archers, which is a BBC sort of radio drama, when it was playing, they'd have agitated storylines of people shouting at each other. That's not good. Don't put on drama. We found that classical music, classical FM, in the background, or a pop music channel just playing at very low level, created an ambience. She always had the company up there of the music, and it just helped things. It helped us as well, really. Other things, now I've mentioned incontinence things that you can get. Other things that will come essential when they are bedbound is one of those mattress inflator things. And initially we inquired about whether it would be available, and they said they may be able to get us one, and there was a sort of waiting list, which is odd. We went on eBay and we found it, and we just bought it right there and then, and we had it. And it wasn't ideal. They do wear out after a while, but these things have they're basically inflatable mattresses, but they've got multiple pockets, and it's a pump, an air pump, like a standard aquarium air pump, and a sort of diverter valve that rotates slowly, and it just purrs away quiet in the background, and it inflates the alternate pockets in the beds. And the whole point of that is to prevent bed sores. Bed sores are when something has been pressing hard against the bed, all the weights pressing the bed or a seat for a long time. You can get them for seats as well. And it stops the blood flow in that area, and basically speaking, the lack of oxygen means that you end up with rot setting, I suppose, is what happens. You get a sore. And it requires loads of treatment. It's much better preventing them. All this stuff that you could possibly ever need is on eBay. That's just a revelation. It wouldn't have been available in the past. Amazon, eBay, online, all your medical requirements are there, and it's cheaper and easier and faster than going through formal channels. So let me think. I've covered the drugs, the care homes, the getting bedbound, the baby food, the inflators, music, hands curling, hard to feed. The other thing is, it'll be tough. There'll be times, things like when you have to start changing your mum's panties. That's a bit, at first, but after you've been doing it for a while, get lots of rubber gloves, the sort of disposable gloves, lots of paper towel. You'll get used to it, and you just end up nursing them. You just end up looking after them. It comes as a natural caring instinct. But also do make sure you keep living your own life in the background. Don't stop your life completely. I mean, it will stop you going to work. I should mention, a care home costs in the UK something like £1,000 a week. And if you don't know how long your mum's going to be there, or your dad, it suddenly becomes viable. Unless you earn a lot more than that a week at work, it becomes viable to say, put work on hold and just dedicate time to caring. And me and my brother were lucky we could juggle work and alternate, because we're both single, we're both independent, we could always be there. We had the advantage. It's also important to mention that some families have a member of the family that is available, that they say, oh, well, they're not working, they can go and look after them. It's a 24/7 job, a heavy nursing job all the time. It's really important to say, don't just dump one person with the full responsibility of looking after them, because it will drag them down. It will fatigue them. You have to share the responsibility. Looking after someone in that condition is just, it's a arduous thing. It really is a job. It's longer hours than a day job. So it's just worth remembering that. So in summary, I would say, if you're technically inclined, it's fascinating to watch this happening. You can understand that, my mum loved driving, and even as the Alzheimer's progressed on, she still drove. And you might think that's a bit reckless, but we'd be in the car, she'd be driving, and we'd be monitoring it, and it was fine. And it took a while before we decided, okay, some decisions are not as perfect as they could be. And it's really hard stopping someone from driving. My mum was still fully mentally capable at that time. She didn't like being stopped driving because it was one of her favourite things ever, was out in the car just driving around the country roads. But you have to do it, and it's a hard decision at the time. Lots of hard decisions will have to be made. But the main thing is that your parent or other family member, they become your kid in a way. Things like, I'd take my mum to, we went lots of trips together all the time. We'd go in the bus and we'd go in and just go around places like cafes. It was just endless walks around cafes. We'd get cake and we'd go and feed the ducks. Some people say don't throw cake to ducks, it's not suitable, but the ducks like the cake. And my mum liked the cake as well. She ate quite a lot of the cake. I'm not sure the ducks got any of the cake. My mum was supposed to be throwing them, but that's what happens. We also went into the shops and we'd go into places like Poundland at Halloween and they'd have all their Halloween stock. That's worth mentioning now because as I record this video, their Halloween stock is coming in. It's great. It's really fun. And my mum loved it. Her favourite hat was a big purple glittery witch's hat. We went into Poundland and she grabbed this broom, this witch's broom, and she just loved it. And I said, okay, that's okay, we'll put it back. And she said, someone gave it to me. And it was like, oh, okay, we'll buy your broom. She was so proud of this witch's broom. She was walking along the road, banging it really hard on the pavement, and then it just disintegrated. And we had to pick all the bits up, take it home, and I tie-wrapped it together again for her. But you'll experience, like, we had a couple of Halloweens, we had a couple of Christmases where it was all about my mum. She was our little girl and we were looking after her, and she was so excited in those days. It was like she'd gone back to that time. She was unwrapping her presents, loved the packaging, wasn't so bothered about what was inside them, loved the crinkly packaging and the paper and the ribbons. But it's just, just take it as it comes. It's just like one of these things that when it happens, everything will just make sense. And ultimately, just relax. And understand that, what happens, and you'll learn. It'll be a learning experience. I've told you a lot of what can happen, and you'll discover these traits and funny things will happen. Like the time my mum went into the bathroom and decided, well, the bath is made of porcelain, therefore it's also a toilet, and had a poo in the bath. Lovely. It's just, you can't be angry about it. You just have to laugh off and say, uh-oh, Mum's done something weird again. And this is what happens. I really hope they do make a breakthrough with Alzheimer's. It's also worth mentioning the Daily Mail, a newspaper in the UK, which is aimed at old people. And in order to sell their vile rag, every weekend or so, they'd have a headline that said, "Breakthrough Alzheimer's Cure." And you'd buy it and you'd open it up. And it was just some flippant article about how there might be a cure, but it wasn't really proven. And you thought, oh, well, that's okay. And then a couple of weeks later, they did it again. And a couple of weeks later, they did it again. You realised they were actually using it to sell their paper. And every time they did it, it raised your hopes up and then it dashed them that there was a cure for Alzheimer's. So what can I say about the Daily Mail? Burn in hell, Daily Mail, you worthless, scummy rag, because that is really bad tactics, particularly when they're cycling with cures for cancer and cures for heart disease and strokes and Parkinson's disease. It's a horrible, horrible way to sell your newspaper. But that's what happens. But you know what? You'll end up with lots of happy memories, and when it takes as long as it did for us, when it finally gets to end, it's a huge relief. And you have that knowledge that, I wish there was a cure for Alzheimer's, but ultimately we did what we could. And we made my mum's life as easy as possible. And this is what you can do too. If you're looking after someone, don't take it too seriously. See the bright side. There are, upsides as well as downsides, and everything will just make sense. So relax. Don't get too stressed. Everything is going to be okay.